one you might miss out on, since of course we normally tweet around 7, and you normally, if you don't see the tweet at 7, you have to assume that we're not streaming. But there's this little thing called time zones, you see, and occasionally, well, let's not get into that. Point is that we are late to start today, and therefore we don't expect a lot in terms of how long we'll be going, since the schedule of those who play DOA doesn't necessarily change when the time zones do. This is an Atlantic Rim lobby, more or less, and not everyone on the Atlantic Rim has any use for daylight savings time. Not that we're anywhere near daylight savings time, but again, that's a long story and we're not going to get into it now. For now, we're going to play some Dead or Alive. Feel free to join us if you would like. You just search for 2_MK. Well, rather you search and just join the one with that name. The second match slot will be open. It is a loser stays on lobby. Health is large. Partially, we were practicing for a while with winner stays on, since people were basically at the same level, but we usually switch back to loser stays on once someone makes a breakthrough. As they probably need a little less time to practice. And this is, after all, a team effort both in terms of content and education and actual outcomes of training. As a result of the probably shorter stream, there is likely to be more talking or talking for most of the duration, though there will be periods of silence when there's just nothing specific to say, since we are so focused on the information from the matches themselves today, and given that we are not expecting as many people to join, we probably will not get a lot of matchups that are not familiar to us. If you're somehow familiar with our normal setup, note that the lobby host is different. We have just Vine fighting today.
Do it again?
But the specific matchups that brings to the table aren't necessarily going to be those we've never talked about before. And as noted probably before, it's a little bit difficult to talk in the most sensible, simple manner because first order strategies are not the things usually used between people who know each other really well, or who have specific ways of flowing through the game based on understanding their opponent from a different perspective. Let's say they know that you are this type of player, even if they've never played you before. First order strategies are usually used because they are strong, they are relatively harder to stop at first, or you can make your opponent behave certain ways because you've proven that you know it. But when you have the impression that your opponent definitely knows how to counter the move already, or counter the strategy already, it's a little less likely that you'll see them. can already see the general increases in speed. Sometimes holds. Definitely whiff punishes. And even the sidestep comes in at least a little bit sometimes. So, speaking precisely about strategies here is similar. The first order strategy between these two is definitely something we've discussed, but it's not necessarily what you're seeing here. It's a lot closer to frame data fighting, understanding which moves your opponent might not be able to whiff punish if you throw them out in neutral. Particularly those moves that will only actually check an opponent's approach and not actually reach if you didn't intend to do it. We've discussed that before as well. Specifically in terms of teaching people what type of moves mids and highs and so on are, when to use throws and so on. Understanding your opponent's intent in this game often requires that at a reasonably high level. Understanding when you shouldn't or can't keep hitting is a skill that OmniRabbits literally just recently picked up on. And it's different from game to game, so it's hard to actually sort of sense it. Especially since in new games it's definitely hard to tell when the reason that you got hit was you making the bad decision about whether or not to keep going, or your opponent just being relatively quote-unquote crazy and throwing out buttons in a way or at a timing that normally would be a bad idea if you had kept going. One of the hardest things to learn in games like this when you're facing characters you don't recognize, especially in games with as many moves as DOA, is that specific moment of I stopped attacking, I delayed it, went for like the equivalent of a frame trap, or rather a delayed frame trap, tricking my opponent, or that was my intention, to get my opponent to flinch, think it was their turn, but only able to attack after recognizing this. Safely, that is. But your opponent decided, nah, I think... Either they think that you're going to do it and they hit buttons, or they're not specifically thinking, whether that be instinct or not understanding, and still hit buttons. It's not really something you can or should worry about getting away from either. That is, after all, the thing that makes these games have any spice in them at all. DOA is not as easy to spend time outdistancing the opponent as other 2D games, certainly. And technically, of the 3D games, it's also the least effective at the point. Given the whole system, if you were going to try to outrange your opponent and then do a specific type of thing, they could, at the very last moment, see it coming, block into hold, or just straight up hold. Holds are really powerful in this game. They start basically instantly, and their active time is about a third of a second, 18 frames, almost a third of a second. So if you have ever thought holds are not that strong, I keep on messing them up, it's not something I can be confident in. Just know that the frame data says you should at least try to be. When both characters want to close in on each other as in the last match, the wake-up game is usually a little more simplistic and you could say aggressive than what we're probably about to see. Ayane can fight either from close or relatively far, and she has a good amount of whiff punches, lows that are also attacks that slip through things and strike. And decent holds relative to dealing with punch characters and particularly predictable kick ones. So you can have that moment as just seen where there's definitely been a knockdown, but Ayane feels no need whatsoever to reach you. Fortunately for Mila, she can get through some of this at least, with her strong mid-range mids used to check Ayane's approaches, which also don't easily get punished due to both distance and the style of moves that Mila can follow them up with.
Here we go. Let's go.
Basically, Mila is one of the few characters that can stand up to Ayane's punches, while avoiding enough of those lows to really cause a problem. And while we've specifically said before, oh, treat those rolling kicks as mid-kicks, Mila in particular is a character that you can't necessarily tell when she's going to do certain things. You should generally hold mid-kick when you think she's going to try to reach you suddenly, but it's not necessarily going to be enough. This character's strength, though, is that you won't easily be able to tell which of the things she wants to do, and she does have punches that will reach, so you'd have to be able to keep her off guard enough in neutral when she feels the kicks are required. Her willingness to lunge at those ranges therefore gives her just enough reach to not so much beat out Ayane in those spaces, but to make her have to think about whether or not she wants to try to maneuver around something or use a fast attack to stop Mila from doing things.
Tough at the beginning.
But Whiff Punish was a little too slow that time, and causing us to cycle around. This is definitely another match where, even if I tried to explain half of the things that are supposed to be happening, they're not going to match any of the things that are actually happening. However, we can probably use it to test some of the specific things that I've been discussing with Just Fine about this game's frame data and approach systems. Particularly because Kazumi is a character that breaks some of those rules, but because she does, she doesn't get certain abilities easily. Or rather, the way Kazumi is misleading has a lot more to do with movement than frame data. But I'm also a little bit harder to trick myself in terms of other people's expectations. At least most of the time. Meaning that it might be a little bit harder for the same things to happen. This match requires something I really don't do well. Getting into a defensive mindset at particular timing. I want to move, I want to hit buttons, and I want to hold when things are looking odd. But I can get to the point where I'm calm enough to just not do those things. Eventually. And my opponent's general tendency to stay calm in these situations means that Kazumi's more deceptive reach can do her some good. But still can't get myself to stop attacking, and my opponent will generally not attack until I do. It tends to lead to very, very quiet fights against most people because that's the sort of character I play. If I am not moving, the opponent doesn't have much incentive to try attacking themselves because my characters tend to be very good at stopping any attacks the opponent throws out. Now here's something you'd probably never get to see in any other situation. I'm the only person on the team that plays both of these players, and I don't play Nico enough to face off against opposing Kasumi. Here the first order strategy is likely to be somewhat more effective, because Nico's high unpredictability in movement doesn't come with the same amount of distance problems that Kasumi has. Kasumi tends to be carefully able to throw out confusing things from slower positions, but not actually get anything off them. The key, therefore, is don't let Nico get close in the first place. Can you do this? The key is really the fact that once Nico is trying to get close, she tends to do a lot more holdable moves and put herself in situations to be thrown when they miss. There you get that moment again. I attacked when the opponent had no reason to believe I was going to do anything else. And there we have that moment. You can't actually see the third or even fourth attack in Nico's strings.
Only verified my hypothesis.
I can say that as a Nico player, it was not even that I didn't expect the kick. It's that I didn't even remember that she would have kick as an option. Not necessarily because I don't hit the kick, but that's not the place you normally would hit it. This could mean, of course, that this player is obviously just better than me. But that's part of learning to play the game too. When people are better than you, they have better options than you and a better understanding of how to apply those options. Learning to play quickly without telegraphing your intent or mashing out or twitching because it's that time to twitch is harder to do in this game for most people because the position of the meter really, and by that I mean most people in our team. The best conditioning we have so far is to hit buttons in neutral. But if you feel you must stop because of your opponent's flow, stop for a moment to check your meter. But you don't really need to do that as much when your meter is directly underneath your life bar. And the way that meter can be used in the game doesn't tend to cause the same problems. This is another problem matchup to talk about because there's so many things happening in here that I can't really tell you all of them. Generally, the team does not expect the sort of things I do or can do as much because they don't come up in their own matches easily. Specifically, for example, remembering that you can hold your opponent more easily. If they've been started to hit you as in land hits on a whiff punish than on a counter hit. One use of meter that does change against me generally is because I can usually hold people I don't need to break hold as much. But this also makes me complacent against players who have the options, such as the Nico player you just saw. Well, Omni Rabbit can keep up with that. So you'll get more moments where the throw comes in after the delayed button, and the last one is not strictly hit, and so on. So yeah, that whole fake out, I'm not even trying to discuss any of that. When fighting people who know you well, or rather who know your tendencies well when you are playing with even the littlest bit of autopilot, you have to really put a lot more effort mentally into suppressing the autopilot, or you can say you can go even further beyond and fight with more so an overall intention of yourself, which guides your actions, whether you win or lose. It generally helps when you don't necessarily care anymore if you can let go of that feeling of, this move should work. Because in fighting games, it's very seldom that you can say with any certainty that a move will work. And against most better players, you can't say for sure that a move should work. They always have the option, almost always have the option to do some crazy thing. When people talk about characters being somewhat weaker in many games, it's often that their crazy thing is either a higher risk of taking big damage after it fails, or not super rewarding in its execution. The difference between Gil and Urien in Street Fighter V, for example, is generally that if Urien wakes up with an invincible move, he gets a massive amount of counter carry and sometimes stupidly high damage, and Gil just doesn't.
You look strong, but I will do my best.
This was unnaturally stuttery for... Oh, their connection got worse. Which is sad because it was quite good at the beginning. Showing 1 bar now? Fortunately, from previous games, Omni Rabbit does have some idea how to fight Rachel. The problem is that it is probably hard to do in stutter, and Honoka's specific way of doing it involves being able to see things really well. As you've just seen though, we do have one benefit, sort of. Because these two have the same main move in neutral, namely that basically Honoka got hers from Rachel, they also specifically want to stand in the same place in neutral interactions most of the time. Honoka's best bet, honestly, is because the two fight in mid is, yeah, it's basically to do that. Because most of Rachel's good ways of dealing with that move involve sidestepping, and Rachel is not a character that tends to position herself such that there's either not enough room for Honoka to do the flying kick, or that she gets enough advantage if Honoka whiffs the flying kick, or is generally used the high hold against and similar. So Honoka doesn't necessarily want to go in on any knockdowns, which she's good at getting. Partially because Rachel doesn't have a good spacing she can close to that won't involve having to think about the flying kick. When they are in neutral interacting like that, you'll get a lot more of similar moves happening, because that's just the way it is. And Rachel's punches, her good stuff is mostly mids, making it relatively easy for Honoka to hold when she's at least in sequences. You can't necessarily hold in neutral because, again, they're both looking for that mid kick a lot of the time. Honoka does have the mid kick itself though, which is a good enough tool for with punishing a lot of things Rachel wants to do in the first place. This is not likely to work on Omni Rabbit as easily, yeah, because of that. You can absolutely time it so that you will mostly get people. But the stutter is probably causing some suffering on both sides at this point. You can literally see the combos dropping in real time. The hard part about this is usually recognizing when Rachel is far enough away from her own pushback that you should hit a button, because she's not an easy character to throw. She's often advantaged enough, has good spacings to move through, and so on, that she will mostly get out of your throw even if she has to tech it. Using your fastest mid is often a good way to go about it because of her movement style, but this is also why she has that twirl. They should still have that. They shouldn't take it away. It wouldn't make any sense to. I just haven't seen anyone use it recently at all, now that I think about it. But you see the tactics coming up. Pushing to this corner, and technically this corner, drastically limits Honoka's ability to use the flying kick. But she can't easily circle out because Rachel definitely has enough tracking and output. You can't just go, oh, I'll sidestep now. You have to do that on knockdowns too. But Omni Rabbit goes for it and manages to get the corner anyway. That moment there is what I was referring to in the match we had before. When you have whiffed a move entirely and your opponent manages the whiff punish, if you know the combo, if you think they're going to flinch and try to hit something quick, if you know their most autopilot-y combo, you can almost always hold it. Because the frame data doesn't shift due to the counter hit. Today we have 4 open matches available. Obviously the ones on stream are going to be the ones in match 1, but that means that you can use it when you don't want to be on stream for some reason.
No way. I'm giving this all I got.
Ayane's specific form of approach and zoning also make it relatively easy for Honoka to use that flying kick in the same way, but she should generally expect that she has to read that or do it early enough into Ayane's approach that when she whiffs over Ayane's head, and she will because Ayane approaches using things that make her go low at least half the time, that things will be fine right after. Otherwise she can definitely be punished. But using it enough can discourage Ayane from attacking or trying to get to the neutral space where she has other options that are tricky. And while Ayane absolutely benefits from just seeing this move coming because it's not super hard to do, and using a hold to sidestep it, her specific methods of damage afterward don't always keep up with the requirements for this matchup in terms of the damage race the two face. Honoka being a character that can get around your wake up no kick altogether really helps. You could say she has better pressure, but it's not quite as simple as that because you can delay those moves quite a lot, and therefore the opponent does end up in problems. The thing that does mean that you can get away with it on Honoka's side is that delaying your own wake up to avoid being high crushed by Honoka's hop kick, for example, leads to very little damage from most characters because what did you delay to wake up with? You didn't delay and get anything, you stood up normally, and the move recovers in such a way that it doesn't matter. This is actually one of the things you don't think about in terms of games like this, but is a form of pressure. In the high crushing mid can be used this way on your opponent wake up, not because it will always work, or in that fact that you should even remotely think about it that way, but that you won't take much damage from doing it, and in Honoka's case in particular, you can convert fairly well into advantageous situations at least by doing it.
Hey, no hard feelings. Let's see how strong you are.
In this arena where getting away from Mila is much harder, she gets some advantage against Diana, and you do have to learn in this game in general to get yourself advantages by changing your playstyle according to the stage if your character requires it. Generally, the designers seem to have made a great effort to make sure you're not completely disadvantaged, partially because of the large number of moves available. And more importantly, the fact that when people have strong advantages based on stage, it usually comes with a disadvantage of their own. Specifically, the sort of character that has enough variance in their own playstyle or in their own capabilities to get an advantage from a bigger or smaller or more linear or less linear stage, generally also loses something else in their toolkit because of this.
Tough at the beginning. What happened?
In Ayane's case, she generally has to sidestep more or think more about her offense, because if she's held, the way that many moves affect Ayane will put her up against the ropes and in the corner relatively quickly. It's therefore fairly easy to flip the situation if you can in fact read her. We're probably about to see a rotation in terms of who is playing. And as this is a loser stays on lobby as noted, and not everyone is staying for long today. In fact, the lounge itself is not staying for long today, but you know. It's likely that whenever our Indigo Wolf would be sent off the station either by victory or defeat, as it is specifically 3 consecutive losses as your limit for loser stays on. That will most likely be our last Mila action for the night. Now we're into more cramped quarters, but even more complicated than the last one. Fairly advantage to Mila, because once Mila starts staggering her attacks, it's really hard to know what to do. There are 2 main options because of Mila's relative linearity in her strikes. You can assume that Mila will be sidesteppable and use something like your 8S or 2S to get around it, particularly because the attack that comes out of it is relatively effective against this character. We've seen this on Diego before, for example. The other option you have is to just throw because you think she's going to stop for a moment. It's quite helpful sometimes to break this game down to that sort of thinking in terms of interactions at close range. Your opponent is either going to keep hitting buttons or not. It's all you really care about. Sometimes there's maneuvering things and tricks, but once they're in close, you have to understand that mostly things like pushback in this game are really advanced and don't come up that often. The main interactions are, do I think I can hold them? If I don't think I can hold them, why don't I think I can hold them? And if they have a ton of options that prevents me from holding them, are these options things I can just sidestep out of, or use one of my own move that moves my hurt dots? While that often sounds really complicated, it's more so complicated in the abstract. It's not terribly hard to do when you've played your own character long enough to understand them. Hitomi, unfortunately, is a character that doesn't really benefit that much here. She's not the best at holding Mila because of many things, and has to rely on the sidestep versus throw situation. That said, it's a relatively easy rewire physically, as you can just sidestep instead of holding. What you need to watch out for usually is the emotional reaction to getting hit anyway, because you have to think in that moment, wait, what did I get hit by? You'll generally find that on-stream people need to... What will happen often is that it will be demonstrated, particularly if it's the wolf that's being fought, because By the time I finish saying whatever it is, the wolf has probably figured out the counter to the correct action and will normally do it around that same time. So you'll get situations like that where the only time technically that going for the diving tackle was strictly speaking a good idea was after enough conditioning, let's say, or enough discussion about the way you should stop Mila. Whereas that move is both risky and basically the only thing that gets through it. It's definitely something you have to think about a lot when fighting people that you know well, particularly people that you know well who know about how long it takes for you to get frustrated at something. But you don't really have to think about it that way. The only thing you really care about in most games is, how do I stop myself from coming to the conclusion that this was a waste, that this was never going to work, that my opponent can just do this other thing. That's one of the most toxic things you can do to yourself in fighting games. Going, my opponent can just do this extremely unsafe move to get around my really obvious counter. But here we are dealing with Nico again. And unfortunately for her, I don't really play Nico against her. But the same principle applies. Nico is super whiff punishable if she tries to play neutral, and super hard to hold and deal with when she gets closer. But she also can be sidestepped. The bigger problem with Nico's flow is that if you are already being hit, you're basically locked down. You're not going to get out of that easily without either break holding or knowing what she wants to do. She can be thrown though, and she can be thrown after very specific moves. Namely, anything that looks like it might have gone under one of your highs. That is, of course, the balance. You should often hit your quickest attack against people just to get out of the situation, because she's gonna stagger things. She's the character I play, you know what's gonna happen. And because of this, she has moves that will specifically go under you doing this. However, if you did keep blocking, you can throw almost all of these moves. This is one of those matches where your S button actually has a fairly high use. You're either hitting S or waiting for a throw. That S might be because it's break hold time, or might just be, hey, I'm mashing out with S. But Nico doesn't have a lot of benefits, ways of getting around the break hold. So much of how she flows has to do with either delaying attacks. You can go for a throw. In fact, I personally am very fond of doing this. And she has good throws to go in that space. But overall, you can think of it as basically fighting me. She's a very twitchy person character. So just punch her really fast, and if she keeps on getting out of that, then you block and then throw her. Because she probably is not going to get out of hold. Break hold is therefore really effective, much more effective than saving your meter for anything else, because she's not really a character that's going to let you do anything else. Even if you did go for your big attack and expect to get out of it, you're only going to get so much out of the damage. What you generally don't want to do, especially if you're not confident in your pressure, is go in on Nico on wake up, because all you've created is a situation where she is close to you, but you didn't get what you wanted. That judgment, however, from Aritomi was quite good, because knowing that twitchy people tend to want to hit buttons to get out of situations, and the break hold will put her in a corner position which is disadvantageous enough, was probably a good call there.
This only verified my hypothesis.
Why don't I have this costume color yet? This is an affront, and I should remedy it immediately. have, however, thought of something I can say about this matchup between these two players that can actually be converted into something useful to learn.
I'm giving this all I got.
Both of these characters have a relatively strong attack out of sidestep. If you're not familiar with how attack out of sidestep works, basically you press 8S or 2S and immediately hit the button again. Now, most characters want to do this at close range, because, you know, it's helpful to do so. In fact, there are multiple, I think there are often multiple attacks out of sidestep, but they do generally require the execution to be done through the special sidestep versions. The one that won't turn into a walk, basically. And it's quite fast, so you should think of it as all one move when you do it. The main thing about this matchup and these two characters is that because of the way they interact, they want to use this move as a neutral tool a lot more often. This is because they have relatively linear attacks that can reach the other but are hard to see coming. The sidestep can get you around them, and this will help to play neutral better. Not that you should take out the other aspects of it, but it's definitely still there. Hitomi's other good option here is that Honoka has a lot of trouble when she's in an offensive flow and has to deal with Hitomi's charged P plus K, I believe it is. I think it's down back P plus K. The point is that definitely there is a move in Hitomi's arsenal, an elbow strike, a relatively lowish elbow strike, I believe, that she can hold long enough to be a problem. This often comes up when the two of them have just had an interaction. So scrambles are a good place to use this move because it does attack fairly far forward and creates a moment of unpredictability in terms of time. You don't know whether or not to try to stop her from doing the move, wait for her to do it and then try to hold it, because she might whiff altogether. And once you're already under stress, getting the timing for the hold right is also harder. Ayane can use a similar method to avoid the flying kick that we spoke of before. However, the way her sidestep and strike work require her to get to a very specific space on the screen that Honoka's generally not going to just let her get to. It can be therefore very stressful because it involves a lot of walking forward and preparing to do a sidestep move. That you get punished fairly hard when you get it wrong. On the other hand, it does have one big benefit. It creates a neutral if situation similar to the one I was talking about before, when it came to mostly being close up. Specifically, that Ayane can generally either be ready to do that sidestep or be ready to mid-kick hold. She doesn't have to think about a whole lot else in neutral, unless she wants to run all the way in, which is a thing she can do when the opponent gets into the mental state of, okay, you're going to try to stop me from keeping you out. I'm going to wait for something and then be ready, but no, then you have a way around that. Stages like this, where you can get the opponent to bounce off the wall, are particularly bad for Ayanis to have to deal with here, because when Honoka does actually land the flying kick, depending on her position on the screen, she gets to keep the combo going. Which is just painful, really. This game does involve you learning things like that, damage maximizers. And this can make fighting high-level players feel really depressing because they just do more damage in the same situations. But when you've gotten to the point of knowing that's it, the fight isn't necessarily less enjoyable, it's just shorter. That is in fact partially why we play loser stays on. Because the OA tends to flow this way. It tends to be such that the person winning is either completely dominant and neutral to the point where the other person needs some time to learn some things, or just has better combos and does reasonably more damage, or better setups. Better setups part we often care about, but loser stays on is a good way to get people who really know how to keep the damage going to keep doing certain things.
Don't make me laugh.
So you can often get to improve your neutral or wake-up game or little things because your opponent is not going to so aggressively take advantage of your lack of knowledge and then get big conversions. When there's less at stake, even high-level players are often the type that will stop for a bit to practice their own neutral to see if they can get advantage in getting in or otherwise. And while it definitely won't lead to you winning necessarily, we don't specifically mind if the high-level player does stop fighting to some extent in order to keep on playing themselves if they are, you know, not interested in waiting around too long before they get to fight more. We only request, if this is somehow ever going to get through to anyone joining these, that you don't necessarily do it right off the bat, because it's really, really disconcerting when you do. You can give your opponent a handicap by letting them hit you a bit first, but that really doesn't matter, because all you're just going to do is convert on your own big damage again anyway. It's better to do your riskier options and work harder for the same situations. Honoka has a little bit more problems with Nico because Honoka can't keep Nico out as easily, and she doesn't get to do a certain set of attacks as much. This is remedied by sidestepping a lot, mostly because while Nico's movements do tend to lead her in close, Honoka can handle Nico when she's close. What she can't easily handle is getting the character to the space where she doesn't want to hit buttons. Sidestep also causes the same thing we've talked about many times, slightly confusing the opponent as to how far away you are. This won't necessarily help as much against Nico because she will keep advancing, she doesn't care. But even her advancing moves are often linear enough that you might still be able to sidestep out of them if you stutter your sidestep a bit. In fact, just watching her now, you can see the number of moves she has that are very unlikely to trap you. And you can see right there that ducking up punch is actually not that one, the other one. It's actually relatively throwable because your opponent doesn't have good options after it. Having the unblockable kick helps a lot. When we do make this bot, it's almost certainly going to be about exactly that, teaching you how to recognize your turn after a sidestep, because that's one of the things that holds people back in this game the most. Sure, you're sidestepping, sure your opponent's move whiffed, but you didn't know it was going to whiff. You have to learn that it's going to whiff, which is difficult. This time we're actually going to play this match. The requirement here is, as noted, not so much about not attacking or finding the right moment to strike my opponent's counter hit. And from Hitomi's side, it generally is supposed to be about defense, but there is definitely ways to make the defense harder. Specifically, I can what we generally within the team call turn invisible. My characters have a lot easier time hiding their intent than others. But, as I think I've discussed on some other stream, the general downside to this is not being able to keep your defense up while doing it, because of the mental state you have to get into, as well as just generally being more relaxed. It means that you can't do that as easily. From there you can rely on any understanding you have of your opponent's moveset, or which holds you can do against them, while minimizing damage you're taking. And there's that deceptive range I mentioned before. Kasumi's deceptive range also helps in those situations where you've managed to get yourself to the max range of someone's move and been hit, but you know that they can't reach you with their next one. But I lost it for a moment because I usually lose it at that spacing. Turning invisible is the way to unnerve your opponent enough to think that you won't do anything, or that they can't predict what's going to happen next. It removes the relatively binary defend or attack, and puts the opponent into a state where they have to think more about not only the defense or attack option, but the timing of both those things. Once an opponent has started to think about the timing of an attack and the fact that their range might be off, that's basically all you need to do. Convince your opponent that they might miss for any number of reasons, and it becomes easier to take your own actions. This is, however, our last on-stream match of the night. Despite the fact that we did start late, we don't intend to necessarily play that much longer, so one more showdown. Lounge often stays open a while longer, but honestly I'm not expecting that a whole lot tonight. We haven't had much chance to test the new Dalsim bot across team members. Timing weirdness, work projects, uncertainties relative to stuff. Y'all know how pandemics are, everyone is in one. By definition. Is that close quarters again? While Hitomi does not need break, hold as often against Ayane, she does often need her up plus kick. This move is actually really fast. The problem is that it does not hit lows, and therefore can whiff under Ayane's attacks quite often, but it is a good damage minimizer because a lot of ways that Ayane tends to land attacks rely on the opponent actually being on the ground for her conversions. And because of the way that they interact, there isn't a lot of timing where Hitomi will get hit by the second hit of Ayane's approaching attacks while this is still happening. Characters that can delay or get a lot of advantage on their knockdowns in specific ways benefit a lot more from this, but Ayane really isn't so much that character, so you can press it to get out of stuff. This is her 9k I'm talking about. I think it's 9k? Pretty sure it's 9k because I've hit it recently in order to test things. Yeah, there we go. But it's not really an offensive tool. It's not there to help Hitomi get damage. It's there to help Hitomi avoid damage. And the part that makes those types of moves hard in most matchups is understanding that there are times when they work really well and other times where they do basically nothing. And those things are going to rely a lot more on your opponent's idea of how to play the matchup than on any specific given thing. However, due to the hitboxes, Ayane can't necessarily just go for low moves on startup as just shown. We're done for the night though. You can find all -mk.org and information about whenever we will eventually put out that Dalsim bot. Maybe we'll put out the page first or something. This guidance might not be the best idea. But if we do happen to do it tomorrow because we finished a lot of testing in one day, look out for our tweet on 2_MK_FGC on Twitter. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.